A lot of people have asked me, I've written two books, and one was defending hate speech, and the other one was defending pornography. And a lot of people say, why are you defending that unpopular kind of speech whose messages I may well disagree with? Certainly if it's racist speech, I disagree with it vehemently. But the point is, I have to come to the defense of the speech that is subject to censorship. My name is Nadine Strassen. I am a law professor at New York Law School, where I teach constitutional law. For 18 years, I was the national president of the American Civil Liberties Union, and I'm still a very active advocate for civil liberties, including free speech and campus freedoms. I've been interested in free speech issues ever since I could talk, and I learned that by being subject to censorship. I have very strong, before I knew the terminology, free speech and censorship, I just thought teachers in grade school were being very unfair when they told me basically to shut up because they didn't like the questions I was asking, they didn't like the answers that I was giving. And so later on, when I learned that there was actually a constitutional protection, that met up with my deepest instincts as a kid. When I was in junior high school, the Vietnam War was just heating up, and it was the very beginning of anti-war protest movements. There were teachers at my school who simply exposed students to images of the war, very disturbing images. They didn't even have any textual commentary, but there was a criticism, or at least questions, that were raised by virtue of seeing these distressing images of people being killed and lands being devastated. And that led to enormous outcry by political leaders in the town, calling for the firing of these teachers and stopping them from raising those issues to the students. So I think I was about 13 years old, I wrote my first letter to the editor of the local paper. I was very proud that it got published, defending the right of the teacher. And again, I didn't really know the language. I just had this instinctive sense that that was their right, and it was also my right. I also started a petition drive in my school to get signatures in defense of the teachers. So, it goes back a long way. Free speech to me was always a prerequisite for other rights. So I went to college at a time that the anti-war movement was really strong on my campus and many campuses. I went to many anti-war protests, but the really popular position on my campus was a much more radical one. So we started seeing, this is in the late 60s, early 70s, we started seeing shouting down of speakers who were defending the war, including speakers from the government, shouting down of students. We then had a ROTC on my campus, students who were choosing to go into the military, they were shouted down. And again, I had the instinct, even though I was anti-war, to me it was much more important to be in favor of free debate, including about the war, including hearing pro-war perspectives. So that continued to be the most important issue to me, and I definitely wanted to pursue it in law school and beyond. I would say for me the most interesting and memorable cases are the ones where there is a conflict or a tension between freedom of speech and other values. The ACLU defends all fundamental freedoms for all people, and I know FIRE also defends due process and equal protection and privacy, as well as free speech, and there are some tensions, right? If you're a pure free speech advocate, you're going to care less about personal privacy as a defense to freedom of information. And so I think it's really, and there are so many organizations that will reflexively advocate only in favor of one issue. I think it's really important to have organizations that do what government officials should do, which is to do their best to neutrally balance all issues. So the ACLU has always been on the forefront of reproductive freedom. That's another issue that historically has been very important to me. When I was in college, a doctor was being prosecuted for having performed a health-saving abortion on a woman. This was before Roe versus Wade. I was very involved in the reproductive freedom movement and the women's rights movement, and yet I'm so proud of and have always advocated in support of the ACLU vigorously defending the right of pro-life, anti-abortion protesters outside abortion clinics. But they have to do it in a way that doesn't actually disrupt people from going into and out of the clinics. So I'd say that those to me are the more interesting and challenging cases where, and another really classic example which happened slightly after I got out of law school, probably the most famous ACLU case other than the Scopes case, which was way before my time, the so-called Skokie case, where we defended the free speech rights of neo-Nazis to demonstrate in Skokie, Illinois, a town that has not only a large Jewish population, but a large population of Holocaust survivors. My own father is a Holocaust survivor. Many of his family members were murdered by the Nazis, and the head of the ACLU at the time, Aryeh Neier, was himself a Holocaust survivor who had been born in Germany. And what was a little bit paradoxical for many people is they didn't understand that, especially if you're a member of a vilified minority that is never going to get political power, you are especially dependent on freedom of speech. And I was so proud that the ACLU stood up for that position. I was happy to advocate it, even though we did lose about 15% of our members nationwide over it. It showed that we had the courage of our convictions and neutral principles, and ultimately led to a stronger organization as well as stronger free speech principles. The truth is, if you take even a little bit of a longer view about history, we have made so much progress in this country and around the world, quite frankly, in freedom of speech. The idea that even when I was in college, most of the now classic Supreme Court decisions about free speech hadn't yet been decided. The Supreme Court was still enforcing this rule that any speech could be censored as long as it had a bad tendency, quote unquote, that it might lead somebody to have a negative idea that might lead to a negative action sometime in the future. So we've made enormous developments and strides forward, I think, in terms of understanding and appreciation culturally, but for every 2 steps forward, sometimes there's a step backward, or sometimes it's the other way around. Unfortunately, the issues on campus haven't changed very much. You know, the ACLU brought the first challenges to campus hate speech codes in the late 1980s when they first came in vogue. And even though we won those cases, as anybody who follows FIRE's wonderful work knows, hate speech codes are still rampant on more than 50% of college campuses. They're not straightforwardly labeled as such, but that's basically what they do. I would say for a student whose viewpoint is being suppressed, that he or she has a real responsibility, and I know it's a tough one, to stand up not only for that person's own rights, but to bear in mind that you are also standing up for the rights of everybody else. No, number one, the right of other students and other members of the campus community to hear your point of view. And number two, it's going to set in motion a process that will liberate other unpopular perspectives and viewpoints on campus. And ultimately, that's not only is it a service, it's an essential element of education, of academic freedom, and of preparation for engaged citizenship in a democracy. Fire plays an absolutely critical role because the assaults on free speech on campus are of epidemic proportions, and there's no other organization, including the ACLU, that has the resources to focus specifically on that very widespread, very important problem. No law is self-enforcing, right? The First Amendment itself isn't self-enforcing. Any statute that tries to implement the First Amendment isn't self-enforcing. It is only worth the paper it is written on. To paraphrase the First Amendment's author, James Madison, basically said it's only a parchment barrier against government violations. You need actual people on the ground who are going to make it a reality in their particular communities. And I think one of the very most important things that FIRE does is to work with and educate students on campus, because they have to be the monitors as to what's going on there, and to stand up against it, and when necessary or helpful, to enlist the expert support of FIRE staff members.